Good evening. While the ceasefire in the Iran conflict hangs by a thread, and both the United States and Iran continue to claim victory, there is one nation that has truly emerged on top, a fact largely overlooked by much of the mainstream analysis. It is neither of the two countries embroiled in Operation Epic Fury, nor is it Israel. The real winner is a nation already engaged in a war of its own, but one that has brilliantly leveraged the events in Iran to strengthen its own position. That winner is Ukraine. Ukraine has demonstrated geopolitical skill beyond measure throughout Operation Epic Fury. From being first in line to offer assistance to the United States when it became clear that the operation would last more than a few days, to transforming itself into a key player in Gulf defense, Ukraine has masterfully positioned itself as the most important partner to many of the nations that Russia and even the United States have courted in the past. This makes Ukraine the big winner in Iran, and so much of what we are now witnessing can be traced back to Ukraine's own battlefield and the Russian weakness that is constantly on display there. Let us take the last couple of months as an example. In March and April, Russia experienced its worst 2 months of the Ukraine war since 2024. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russia made practically no real territorial gains in March. April was even worse. The ISW states that Russia experienced its first net territorial loss since August 2024, which is the month that Ukraine launched a daring counter-invasion into the Russian region of Kursk that eventually forced Putin to churn through over 63,000 of its soldiers, including 4,000 troops from North Korea, to overcome. Add to all of this a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the southeast that has resulted in Ukraine clawing back around 10% of the territory that it lost to Russia in 2025, and a Russian casualty rate that is averaging about 35,000 soldiers per month, and you see that Ukraine has far more momentum than Russia would want you to believe. This reversal of territorial momentum is highly unusual for a major power engaged in a protracted conflict, suggesting a significant degradation of offensive capabilities that belies traditional military doctrine. It indicates a strategic stalemate, not merely a tactical pause. What does any of this have to do with Ukraine winning in Iran? The answer is simple. Important nations in the Gulf are taking notice of what Ukraine is doing, and they are realizing that Ukraine is the answer for many of the problems that they now face. So much of what we now see in Ukraine comes down to the development of an increasingly sophisticated and multi-layered drone-based strategy for which Russia has no answer. Ukraine has gone on the offensive with mid- and long-range strikes that shatter Russian weaponry and destroy key infrastructure inside Russia itself. Russia's oil has been a particular target, as we saw with Ukraine's targeting of Russia's Baltic Sea export hubs, which put about 40% of Russia's total oil exports out of commission. But the most important development comes defensively, as Ukraine has spent years building drones that can counter the long-range weapons that Russia has been launching into its territory. Chief among those weapons are Russia's Shahed-type drones, and it is here where the link to Iran comes into play. Russia only has Shahed drone technology because Iran provided it. Iran's regime has been providing Shaheds directly to Russia since 2022, and it has also licensed the technology so that Russia can build its own Shahed variants. These are the weapons that Ukraine has been forced to counter. But more importantly, in the context of Ukraine being the ultimate winner of the war in Iran, Shaheds are also the drones that Iran has been using to launch unprompted attacks against other Gulf nations. The Gulf nations need someone who can help bolster their defenses. Ukraine is that someone. Over the last few months, Ukraine's introduction of interceptor drones into its air defense arsenal has seen it become the world's foremost authority on how to deal with Shaheds. In March, Ukraine claimed a roughly 90% interception rate of Russia's Iran-made drones, much of which was made possible by the development of low-cost interceptor drones that allow Ukraine to forego the use of expensive interceptor missiles to deal with inexpensive Shaheds. That is the capability that the Gulf nations want to develop, and they all know that the only way to get a combat-tested version of Ukraine's increasingly layered air defenses is to go to the source. Achieving such a high interception rate against massed, inexpensive drone attacks represents a paradigm shift in air defense, challenging the long-held assumption that cost-effective countermeasures are inherently less capable. This innovation could redefine future asymmetric warfare strategies globally. Here is where this gets serious for Russia. Ukraine emerging as such an important player in Gulf defense is wreaking havoc on what we knew about geopolitics before the Iran war began. First, there are the deals to cover. Ukraine's success against Russia's Shahed-type drones has led to it attracting suitors all over the Middle East, all of whom want to use Ukraine's technology to defend themselves against Iran's use of the same types of drones. That is win number one for Ukraine, and it has leaned into that win brilliantly. Not long after Operation Epic Fury began, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, undertook a tour of the Middle East. The Atlantic Council labeled that tour a masterclass in wartime diplomacy, and it was right on the mark. This single tour showed that Ukraine has growing geopolitical clout. The fact that Gulf nations were even giving Zelensky the time of day showed that Ukraine's military profile has risen to the point where even nations that are thousands of miles away have to take notice. But this tour was about more than Zelensky getting some FaceTime with the most powerful leaders in the Gulf. Zelensky was shopping Ukraine's wares, and several of the nations that have come under attack from Iran were more than happy to buy. Ukraine's president left the Gulf with a trio of new defense deals that would see Ukraine provide drones and its air defense expertise to some major players. Each of those deals lasts for a decade, and they were signed with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Ukraine has wasted no time in making good on its end of these deals. By mid-March, Ukraine had sent over 200 of its military experts to the Gulf to help its new partners set up their new air defense networks. 1 month later, Zelensky revealed that those experts were doing more than merely advising their new allies. They were actively getting involved in the Gulf conflict by using interceptor drones to destroy Shaheds that Iran had launched at its neighbors. This is a deadly form of drone diplomacy, and it lies at the heart of why Ukraine has become the major winner in the Iran war. All of this means two things for Ukraine. First, it signals a seismic shift in how Ukraine is viewed on the world stage. For the first few years of the invasion of its territory, Ukraine was viewed by many as a brave country that needed as much assistance as possible from the West to stand a chance of surviving against Russia. Ukraine was a recipient, not a provider, of weapons. It is inaccurate to claim that Ukraine is no longer a recipient, as it will still gladly accept any help that it can get. But the country has evolved on the defense front. It is now a legitimate partner to many of the nations that are helping it, and, in the case of the Gulf, it has shifted to becoming a supplier. Ukraine is developing into an important arms exporter, and it is all due to the country's ability to produce low-cost drones that are as effective, if not more so, than the expensive alternatives that other nations offer. Second, and perhaps even more importantly, these Gulf deals mean more than Ukraine building a handful of new relationships. They are recognition of the fact that Ukraine has become indispensable in a region where it had no presence, even as recently as a couple of months ago. Before the Iran war, the likes of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were not looking to Ukraine as a defense partner. Why would they? Both nations had plenty of military hardware, and there would be no reason to think that they would face the kind of threat that made partnering with Ukraine a necessity. Operation Epic Fury, and the Shahed-laden response that it prompted from an Iranian regime that is lashing out at everything and everybody, changed all of that. What was once sympathy from the Gulf states for Ukraine's plight against Russia has morphed into synergy as those nations realize that they need Ukraine. That is according to Maria Zolkina, who is a conflict researcher. We reached a level of pragmatic interest in 2026 when Ukraine showed its added value, and that fit well with Gulf countries' desire to diversify their security partners, Zolkina tells the New Voice of Ukraine, as she notes that Ukraine has become a laboratory of solutions for new tech that can be used to counter the most modern military threats. That is a good point. Ukraine is not becoming such a major player in Gulf geopolitics through its willingness to help alone. Everything that it is now providing through the new defense deals is battle-tested and proven to work. The Ukraine war has become a testing ground that is far better than any isolated laboratory. Pragmatism rules all. If it does not work, it is not built, and it will not be offered to potential partners. The reason why we covered so much of Ukraine's battlefield success earlier is that these successes show the proof in the pudding. What Ukraine offers to the Gulf works. And this is where we start to see a major shift that Putin never saw coming. Ukraine turning provider in the Gulf is just the starting point. Ukraine is getting plenty in return. It is building partnerships outside of the Gulf, and it is exposing Russia on a global scale to complete a turnaround in geopolitics that places Russia on the back foot. All of these are reasons why Ukraine is the ultimate winner of the Iran war, and that changes everything. While we are here, this is why we make the military show, to demonstrate how power really moves. Now, the deals that Ukraine has signed in the Gulf have a roundabout effect. Ukraine is not just sending over drones and experts out of the goodness of its own heart. This is a political power play by Zelensky, and it is already getting results. In return for Ukraine's drones, the Gulf states are compensating Ukraine by providing it with what it needs to continue its fight against Russia. The likes of Saudi Arabia and Qatar have become oil lifelines for Ukraine, following a winter when Russia did everything that it could to batter Ukraine's energy infrastructure into submission. Politico reports that supplies of oil and diesel will be making their way to Ukraine. In the case of the crude oil promised to Ukraine via its Gulf deals, that oil will head to European refineries, where it will be turned into products that Ukraine's military can use on the front. Speaking about Europe, we are seeing Ukraine create drone partnerships all over the continent. On April 14th, Ukraine and Germany announced the signing of a new deal that involves Germany supplying hundreds of Patriot air defense missiles to Ukraine, in exchange for Ukraine providing battlefield data that can help Germany prepare its defenses for a potential future fight with Russia. The two nations also announced a joint venture to produce medium and long-range drones, which feeds directly into Ukraine's strategy of destroying the Russian rear to weaken Putin's forces on the front. On the same day, Ukraine and Norway jointly reported the signing of a joint declaration on a defense partnership on the back of talks that Zelensky said involved in-depth discussion about Russia's Shahed-type drones. And on April 16th, Ukraine announced a drone deal with the Netherlands that includes a joint production component. Zelensky even made a stop-off in Turkey as part of his tour of the Middle East, demonstrating that he is more than happy to sniff around a nation that has long held some alignment with Russia, at least on the weapons front. These types of deals are important, and not just for the fact that Ukraine is turning provider. What they all show, and this goes for the decade-long Gulf deals even more, is that a lot of major nations now have a vested interest in Ukraine's survival. This is no longer a case of trying to protect Ukraine against Russian aggression. All of these nations need Ukraine because they realize that Ukraine's survival is the only way that they will be able to defend themselves against Russia and Iran. Ukraine is in a great geopolitical spot right now. The nation is now more important in the entire world's eyes than it has been at any point during its history. But here is where this gets really serious. For Russia, Ukraine being the big winner in the Iran conflict signals a complete shift in global geopolitics. That shift started in the years before the Iran war, when Russia demonstrated over and over that its military is a paper tiger that cannot overrun a much smaller nation that, by all accounts, it should have dominated. But now, and almost solely due to the Iran war, Russia finds itself deteriorating as a global influence in tandem with Ukraine's rise. In a piece for The Telegraph, the outlet's executive defense and foreign affairs editor, Con Coughlin, explains how the situation looked just a couple of short months ago. Prior to the Iran conflict, many Gulf states were seeking to strengthen ties with Beijing and Moscow because of their concerns about the reliability of the U.S. and its Western allies to defend their interests in a crisis, Coughlin points out. That was obviously great for Russia. If it could supplant the U.S. as a supplier to the Gulf nations, then Putin's geopolitical influence would skyrocket. Then Operation Epic Fury started, and with it came Iran's response. Al Jazeera reports that the Arab nations that Iran targeted with its "fire drones at everybody" strategy cost those nations up to $194 billion during the first month of the war in Iran. This staggering financial toll for a single month highlights the immense economic vulnerability of critical infrastructure to drone attacks, far exceeding initial projections for such conflicts. It underscores a pressing need for robust, affordable defense solutions that traditional military spending often overlooks. For Russia, Iran's response was disastrous. For over 4 years, Putin has been cozying up to Iran's regime, leading to the signing of a strategic partnership toward the end of 2025. Iran has been providing Shahed drones to Russia. There were rumors near the beginning of Operation Epic Fury that Russia was helping Iran by providing intelligence. All of this led the Gulf nations that were starting to veer toward Russia as a weapons supplier to ask the obvious question: how can we trust Russia when it supports the nation that is attacking us? Russia's support of Iran may be the gravest geopolitical mistake that Putin has ever made, and he has made plenty of them. All that Russia achieved with this support was playing right into Ukraine's hands. Now, Russia looks like the most unconvincing ally or weapons provider that any nation could have. The results on the battlefield show that. Even if we had not seen Ukraine's impressive push over the last few months, the fact that Russia has burned through over 1.3 million of its soldiers and tens of thousands of units of the very type of equipment that it is looking to sell would have led to potential partners being wary. But now, Putin's desperation to form alliances with anybody that would have him has come back to bite him in the rear that is already pockmarked by relentless Ukrainian deep strikes. Putin misplaced his political backing, and that may well deliver yet another win to Ukraine in the future. Before we get to that, we are seeing the geopolitical turnaround in more ways than the Gulf nations turning their backs on Russian weapons in favor of what Ukraine has to offer. In fact, those nations are just a symptom of a much wider problem that Russia has. In a March 9 report, the Moscow Times revealed that Russian arms exports had dropped by 64% over the past 5 years. Russia might try to explain this away by saying that it needs as many weapons as possible for the Ukraine war, but even that is a sign of weakness. Russia built its geopolitical influence on the back of being able to provide weapons that its partners could use to defend themselves. Even if the downturn in sales is due to what is happening in Ukraine, that only proves that Russia's weapons are ineffective against the combination of Western and homegrown equipment that Ukraine is fielding. And to rub a little salt into Putin's wounds, Ukraine's rise as a weapons supplier is accompanied by the European Union's members combining to sell 4 times as many weapons as Russia during the 5 years in question. Are we seeing the rise of one geopolitical power as another collapses in real time? Perhaps in the long term, but in the more immediate sense, there is one more win that Ukraine gets from the Iran situation. The deals that Ukraine is striking, both in the Gulf and in Europe, strip leverage away from Putin. Russia can no longer use Ukraine's energy situation as a lever, especially if Gulf nations are helping Ukraine in that department. Ukraine's targeting of Russia's oil export infrastructure also means that Putin is struggling to use Russia's own energy production to buy allies. Those attacks also feed into the collapse of a Russian economy that is now entirely centered around a war that Russia is not winning. All of these failures, both domestic and geopolitical, are a problem for Putin during peace negotiations with Ukraine. Putin will continue to trot out his old and tired narrative. Ukraine is on the verge of defeat and should give up now before it gets worse. But Ukraine now has responses in abundance. If Ukraine is weak, why is the Gulf leaning on Ukraine for its defense? Why is Europe doing the same? Why is Russia's oil burning? Why is Russia losing ground on the battlefield? And why would anybody believe the stories that Putin tells when it is clear that more nations than ever before have a vested interest in Ukraine coming out on top? As his mouthpieces sweat at the negotiating table, they will find that none of these are questions that they can answer. The war in Iran has exposed everything. Russia, as a geopolitical force, is weaker than it has ever been, as it proves that it can do nothing to protect an ally that it unwisely invested in, believing it to be a major Middle East power player. The war has also exposed Ukraine's geopolitical brilliance. Every move that Ukraine has made since Operation Epic Fury began has been designed to make Ukraine a vital partner to nations in the Gulf and beyond. Ukraine has basically laid down an Uno reverse card. Russia has nothing left in the deck, which means all it can do is watch as Ukraine becomes the unlikely victor of a war happening thousands of miles away from its territory. All of this will get so much worse for Russia if Ukraine can build on what it has achieved so far to do something that not even the United States has managed to do: reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That waterway is the key to everything in Iran, and it may just be Ukraine that makes the bold moves that could force a reopening.